Going now. Thanks everybody for signing in for this virtual outing with the Grand Canyon Historical Society. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I have an abiding interest in celebrating centennials. And I remember one of the first centennials that I ever commemorated was back in 1986 when I learned it was the 100th anniversary of Geronimo's final surrender in Arizona. And I went down to southern Arizona to Fort Bowie for a 4-day commemoration of Geronimo's final surrender. Also went to Telluride in 1989 for a commemoration of Butch Cassidy's first bank robbery at the Bank of San Miguel in Telluride. And so it occurred to me that 1923 Birdseye expedition was having a centennial last year. So I took an interest in that. And part of the reason that I was interested in that is because Richard Cordaroli, a historian of Grand Canyon, encouraged me to do something like this, as well as Jonathan Upchurch. Both of them gave presentations at our last symposium. And I put Diane Boyer and Roy Webb of Tucson in here because they wrote a book in 2007 that has all of the details about the Birdseye expedition. And I should mention that I am not an expert in this topic. I just have an abiding interest in the expedition. And I used their book to come up with this program that I'm going to share with you tonight. So here's a copy of the Boyer and Webb book published by Utah State University Press in 2007. And then on the right, you can see the water supply paper 556 that E.C. LaRue published as a result of this 1923 expedition. So I just want to give all of that, all those people a shout out. And if you also have an interest in the Birdseye expedition, you might pick up a copy of the book Damming Grand Canyon, the 1923 USGS Colorado River Expedition, also known as the Birdseye Expedition. So this is a real important historical event in Grand Canyon's history because it was the first USGS-sponsored river trip through the Grand Canyon. They also made the first accurate measurements of the river's gradient, and they also measured the discharge of many of the major side streams, such as Nankoweap Creek, Bright Angel Creek, Shinnemoo Creek, and Tapeats Creek. It brought together a number of really important personalities that have played a role in Grand Canyon's history, and it ushered in the era of dam building on the river. And this is something that a lot of people today don't celebrate, but yet the dam building is a very important aspect of the Colorado River's history. When this expedition happened in 1923, only 27 people had previously run through the Grand Canyon, and there were 9 or 10 new people that had run the Grand Canyon as a result. That lasted from August 1st to October 15th. The total trip length all the way to Needles was 80 days. And on this trip, they documented 29 potential dam sites between Lee's Ferry and Black Canyon, which is where Hoover Dam was eventually built. And 22 of these dam sites were within the walls of the Grand Canyon. Fortunately, none of these dams were ever built in the Grand Canyon, although as we'll see later on in the presentation, the backwaters behind Hoover Dam did back up into the Grand Canyon 35 miles. The hydrologist for the expedition, E.C. LaRue, independently proposed 18 additional dam sites in the 1925 publications, which means that there were 47 dam sites in total. Now, they couldn't have ever built all of them because some of them would have overlapped with others. But this is a profile of the Colorado River from E.C. LaRue's report in 1925. And here you can see in the bottom left is the Gulf of California. And then that angled line that is rising up from the bottom left is a profile of the Colorado River all the way back up to Glen Canyon. And as you can see, these major dam sites that were proposed here, they would have backed up with the tailwaters right to the foot of the other dam. If we zoom into just those dam sites that would have been built in the Grand Canyon, we can see that there's about 8 of them here. And the people that were very interested in coming up with this scheme would have had the Grand Canyon be essentially without any running river water in it. So these are some of the participants that partook in this. Claude H. Birdseye was the trip leader and the chief topographical engineer. And the rest of his topographic staff included Herman Stabler, Roland Burchard, and Frank Dodge, who served as the rodman. And then we had E.C. LaRue as the hydraulic engineer and a professional geologist, Raymond Moore, who was still publishing articles in the 1950s and 60s about the geology of the Colorado Plateau. And then the boatman, Emery Kolb, was hired as the head boatman. Lewis Freeman was a boatman and a publicist for the trip. Lee Lint and Elwyn Blake. And there is a book by Elwyn Blake's grandson that has been written about his journals from this trip. And there were 2 cooks. Frank Word did the upper part of the trip down as far as Havasu Creek. And then Felix Kaminsky came in at Havasu Creek to relieve him. So this is Birdseye. He was the oldest group member at 45 years of age. And Birdseye was born in Syracuse, New York, and was an athletic man and played football in college. He graduated from Oberlin in 1901, and then he joined the USGS as a field assistant while pursuing graduate studies at the University of Cincinnati. His supervisor noticed, quote, his rare judgment in adopting methods and in circumventing obstacles that would have puzzled more experienced topographers. He was a distant cousin to Clarence Birdseye, who had made himself famous by flash freezing vegetables, and he became an accomplished topographic engineer. He mapped the Kilauea volcano in Hawaii between 1909 and 1912. And the year after, in 1913, he climbed Mount Rainier while leading a topographic survey in a blizzard on Mount Rainier. In World War I, he was a major with the Corps of Engineers and ended up as a lieutenant colonel as a result of that work. And he was promoted to the chief topographic engineer with the USGS in 1919. He kept his crew size small on this trip and very disciplined. He was very popular with his colleagues who rewarded him with great loyalty, and he carefully selected all of these trip participants. Emery Kolb needs no introduction to fans of the Grand Canyon. He was an experienced Grand Canyon boatman, having done the trip with his brother Ellsworth in 1911 and 12. And why Birdseye settled on Emery Kolb as the head boatman is a mystery that may never be solved. Some people had expected that his brother Ellsworth would be the head boatman, as he had been that for the 1921 cataract survey, and famous river runner Bert Loper was the head boatman on the 1921 and 1922 expeditions on the San Juan and Green Rivers. Additionally, Ellsworth was the sole author of the brothers' book, which could have given him a potential edge, but Ellsworth also had a significant accident when they were running Cataract Canyon at Dark Canyon Rapid, and Emery had led the extraction of the pin boat, which may have influenced Birdseye's choice. Alternatively, he may have chosen simply because of agreements between the two brothers that they would each get a chance to be a laid boatman on a government survey trip. Loper might not have been chosen only because he had never rode through the Grand Canyon. Now, some prickly negotiations developed right away because as soon as the offer had been made to Emery Kolb, he asked for a salary of $1,000 per month and exclusive film privileges. And Birdseye responded that he could only pay him $500 a month and he would not have any film privileges. And Kolb accepted this, but he accepted it very reluctantly, and it appears from the journals that maybe Kolb had kept this resentment with him throughout the whole trip. Birdseye did offer Kolb to bring his own camera. He did that for every one of the participants. They could bring a camera if they wanted, and the government would supply the film. But Kolb was not the official photographer or movie maker for the trip that went to E.C. LaRue. It's incredible to think that the salary that Birdseye offered him was more than his own, and Kolb's salary was only exceeded by that of the director of the USGS. Lewis R. Freeman was the boatman and publicist. Here you can see a photograph taken of him at the foot of Waltenberg Rapid, and this was an odd choice, particularly given the availability of Bert Loper. Freeman was overweight, 44 years old, and had little whitewater experience. He did have flatwater experience in boats, but he was well educated. He graduated from Stanford and lettered in football, track, baseball, and tennis. And at the turn of the century, he was considered the best tennis player in Southern California. He also covered World War I as a war correspondent, and then after the war, he launched a career as an adventure travel writer. And after this particular adventure, he wrote this book, Down the Grand Canyon, which was published in 1924, talking about the exploits of the trip. This is a photograph of E.C. LaRue at Nankoweap Creek. He was an outspoken proponent of Colorado River development schemes, and he was born in Riverside, California in 1879, excuse me, and joined the USGS in 1904, immediately after graduating from Berkeley with a degree in civil engineering. He spent his first year at the USGS as an engineering aide for Reclamation Service and performed his duties with confidence as he was continually bumped up the career ladder. In 1912, he began his association with Colorado River Basin Research, which included interviews with individuals and firms dealing with the irrigation that was just getting underway in the Imperial Valley. The USGS was quite accepting of LaRue's publication in 1916, The Colorado River and Its Utilization, and a letter of promotion for him noted, quote, "The most difficult assignments are reserved for LaRue, and his reports serve as the basis for action in many important decisions by the Reclamation Service." There is the notation that he did win accolades for publishing Colorado River and Its Utilization. He was steadfast in his vision for the development of the river and described by many of the trip participants as gruff, cantankerous, or irascible. And this began to appear in his personality in the early 1920s, just before the trip got underway. And it's thought that it may be due to a case of ulcers or perhaps the financial difficulties that he often experienced as he was forced to borrow money to pay his bills. He did not admit it to anyone, but he was simultaneously afraid of water while still being a fairly good swimmer. And as the launch date approached in 1923, he confided in a letter to his brother that this is a dangerous trip and it is possible some of us may fail to answer the roll call. And then finally, I'll just highlight the geologist that came along, Raymond Moore. This was the last position that was filled by Birdseye. There were other notable geologists who had been invited before Moore, and one of the geologists who was on a prior survey told officials that if E.C. LaRue went on it, one of us would not come out of the trip. The other prominent geologist with experience who turned down the job was Herbert Gregory, Levi Noble, and Hugh Miser. And Miser served on the 1921 San Juan expedition, but he said he had had enough of rivers and river trips. He was a well-published scientist and spoke 6 different languages. And it said that he was insightful, confident, artistic, driven, demanding both of himself and those around him, and he was intolerant of incompetence. So here are photographs of all the other members of the expedition. That is the topographic group up there, along with Rodman Dodge. And then here are photographs of the boatmen and the two cooks down there in the lower right. This is the famous photograph of the group as they gathered at Lee's Ferry in late July. We can see the boatman there on the left, Lewis Freeman looking over the shoulder of Emery Kolb. The one person that was not in this photograph was Frank Dodge, and it's claimed that he was sleeping off a drunk when this photograph was taken. So these are some of the highlights of the expedition. They did capture the attention of the whole nation, and I'll explain how that happened in just a moment. There was quite a bit of publicity about this. One of the things that really interested me is that it took a 2-day drive from Flagstaff to Lee's Ferry. Today, you can do the same trip in just over 2 hours. One of the reasons that the trip got so much publicity is that it was the first time that a radio had been used in the canyon, and they used this radio to hear of President Harding's death soon after the trip got underway. They had resupply points at 4 locations in the Grand Canyon, and I'll talk a little bit about the resupply at Hance Rapid. It also involved the naming of Upset Rapid, and then they were caught in a gigantic flood as they were camped right above Lava Falls in September of 1923. So after the expedition ended, this was the cover of the Scientific American magazine, and this image shows a surveyor on a line going across at the bottom of a deep canyon, and everybody was sure that this image portrayed Burchard doing his work in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So they made their preparations in Flagstaff. This is a photograph of Aspen Street in Flagstaff as it might have looked just about the time that the expedition was getting together. And in his autobiography written decades later, Frank Dodge made several observations of the meeting in Flagstaff when these men were getting to meet each other for the first time. He wrote that Freeman was, quote, an explorer, big game hunter, northern riverman, and at 257 pounds, and was recommended through LaRue. According to Dodge, the meeting was jaw-dropping in Flagstaff. And I'm quoting him here. One day while I was sitting in the lobby at the Weatherford Hotel, who should walk in looking like an overweight sportsman dude, but a nattily dressed man in rompers, wool knee stockings, two-tone Oxfords, and a cane. Wealth and good living stuck out all over him. He followed this with the observation, I can remember reading Cosmopolitan short stories that were illustrated with drawings of huge log-riding supermen tearing through rapids and having shoulders 4 feet across and being some 8 feet tall. Real supermen of the North. And I thought it would be hard keeping up with such a man like this. But despite the first impression, Dodge grew to like and respect Freeman, which not everybody did on the trip. With these lines, Dodge touched upon one of the many personality conflicts that splintered the expedition almost immediately. For most of the trip, the boatmen were divided into fractious groups. Freeman was at odds with Kolb, Blake, and Lint. Lint and Blake, at least initially, were loyal to Kolb. Kolb never stopped grousing about the photography, fanning his conflict with Birdseye, extending it to Freeman and LaRue, both of whom had cameras, and ultimately casting a pall over the entire expedition. Burchard quietly was more sympathetic to the working man and greatly admired Kolb. LaRue was at odds with nearly everyone. Dodge appeared to like Freeman, and later correspondence indicated that he was friendly with LaRue. So those are just some of the things that Frank Dodge wrote about in an autobiography decades after the trip. This is a photograph that was taken on day 2 of their drive up to Lee's Ferry. You can see the tilted rocks of the Echo Cliffs monocline, and there was a heavy summer monsoon season in 1923, and the group was required to rebuild the road between Flagstaff and Lee's Ferry at numerous places. Nonetheless, they did arrive at Lee's Ferry on July 18th, And when they got to Lee's Ferry, they spent 18 days reconditioning the boats. Now, when the 1922 expedition and survey finished at Lee's Ferry, they put the boats in storage that Southern California Edison had made for the survey. And sitting in the storage, they had become a little bit dry and leaky. And so the men would repair and caulk the boats and then soak them in the river water so that the wood would swell up and prevent the leakings in the boat. While they were here for these 18 days, for these 12 days at Lee's Ferry, Emery Kolb had his daughter Edith come up, and she was quite the entertainment for the group because she felt very comfortable in outdoor settings. Some of these men had not spent time in the American Southwest and were a little bit put off by the heat. They recorded temperatures of 111 degrees most of the days they were at Lee's Ferry, and Edith provided a little bit of gaiety to the group. Moore climbed up to the top of the Echo Peaks, and he made this sketch of Marble Canyon and the Vermilion Cliffs as they were camped on the east side of the Colorado River. So the photographic record from the expedition is of great value because this is a baseline looking at various beaches and other reaches along the Colorado River to let us know what the river looked like before the dams were up. Here's E.C. LaRue with his motion picture camera at Vasey's Paradise, and you can see the outfit that he brought with him. Now look at this photograph here. This is Rattlesnake Camp at River Mile 74.7, and I have overlaid a modern picture right there, and you can see how the vegetation has grown up along the beaches there. So you'll notice that there is no vegetation growing at Rattlesnake Camp in 1923. We might just go through that one more time so you can see it. We camp here at this camp quite often nowadays, and there's a partial view of that same beach. You can see a modern raft sitting next to the shore right there, and what a change that has been. So this is a picture of the Westinghouse Ariel Senior radio. Radio transmissions had only begun in the United States in 1920, and just 3 years later, numerous stations were broadcasting, including KHJ Radio out of Los Angeles and the Deseret News out of Salt Lake City. And one of the things that they used this for was to get news from the outside world that would keep the crew engaged with what was going on. But the other thing they would do is that the radio stations would send messages to the crew, knowing that they would listen at night to the radio. And in this way, the crew could learn about weather patterns that were going. So Birdseye remodeled an original unit. It cost about $65 in the day. That's worth about $1,000 today. And he amplified the strength of the radio by using vacuum tubes in it. It weighed about 20 pounds and could receive the outside messages. And when Earl Spammer, who's in on the talk tonight, was copy editing my article for the upcoming proceedings from our history symposium, he said to me that there actually are photographs that exist of the actual radio that went down. And these are photographs that Earl sent me from that. You can see that the radio has been altered a bit, but this is the actual radio that they used on the trip. And using the radio on the second evening of the expedition on August 2nd, the Birdseye crew learned of President Harding's passing while he was returning from a trip to Alaska. He passed away in the city of San Francisco. And amazingly, the crew must have felt that they were living in the future because they learned of the president's death only an hour and 45 minutes after it happened. And here they were in the depths of the Grand Canyon. And it's almost as if it were the 21st century with all of us getting a cell signal down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon and being able to communicate with people back home. Pretty incredible to think of it that in 1923 that could happen. I had just done a trip to Alaska and realized that Warren Harding had been there 100 years previous. And so I read up a little bit about it. And he was actually returning back, and on his way from Alaska down to Seattle, he began to feel ill, and then he probably passed away of a heart attack by the time he got to San Francisco. Another thing that was unknown to me is that he was popular and respected at the time of his death, but his reputation went downhill soon afterwards with the Teapot Dome scandal in Wyoming, where his Secretary of the Interior had some funny business going on selling oil leases. So 8 days later, the party laid over for a full day on August the 10th at a place that was known at the time as Boulder Rapid at River Mile 44. And in honor of the president's funeral, after the trip ended, they renamed this rapid President Harding Rapid, which it remains to this day. And you can see why it was called Boulder Rapid. There's a great big boulder that sits in the middle of the river. This is an unusual rapid in the Grand Canyon, that it's not really formed by debris coming in from a side canyon, but this is actually a boulder that's been dislodged off the cliff and has fallen into the river. Now here we see President Harding Camp. This is where they laid over. If you just look at this picture very closely on the right side, you can see two men sitting in one of the boats in the water. There's another man to the left of them with an upturned boat, and he's washing clothes. And then just about in the center of the photograph, we can see one man giving another man a shave. And farther to the left of that, there are clothes hanging on a line. And thanks to Helen Fairley, we have a repeat photography of this from the exact same place. And this is what that same camp looks like today, where those men were taking a day of rest right there. So this is one of the big things about this expedition, is being able to see what the natural shoreline of the Colorado River looked like before there were dams. Here's another scene at the 75-mile camp looking upstream, and you can see the boats on shore and one of them still floating in the water. So as I mentioned, the expedition had arranged for resupplies along the way. Birdseye knew that there would not be enough food for 80 days for 11 men. And so these resupply points had been prearranged. And here we see the men repairing the boats. They were here at Hance Rapid for 5 days because they arrived here a bit earlier than what was expected. So they made these at Hance Rapid, the Bass Trail, Havasu Creek, and Diamond Creek. And these are places that could easily be accessed in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And what would happen at this time is that Freeman, who brought along a typewriter, would type up reports about the trip, and they would go out of the canyon. And then these reports would be read by KHJ Radio and the Deseret News, and it transfixed the whole nation on what this trip was going through. At the time, it was thought that the Colorado River was really one of the most treacherous and dangerous rivers there was, and so the nation was transfixed on it. The three people you see in the photograph here, Lint and Kolb and Blake, they hiked out. They arrived at Hance Rapid on August 16th, 1923 at about 3:30 in the afternoon. And Kolb said, "Hey, I have a house up on top. Let's go up there." So they left at 3:30 in the afternoon from Hance Rapid. And the idea was that they would walk until it got dark, and they would camp at the top of Horseshoe Mesa, where the old copper mine was now in ruins. They did get to the top of Horseshoe Mesa by dark, but they decided to keep on moving, just taking breaks now and then, and they climbed the last 2,500 feet and arrived at the Grandview Hotel at about midnight. And when they got there, the proprietor of the hotel let them in, and they got a good night's sleep at the hotel. And then in the morning, he drove them into Grand Canyon Village, where they all went to Emery Kolb's house, and Blanche made them a nice dinner that night to celebrate Lint's birthday. And another thing that happened is the next day they had breakfast at the Bright Angel Lodge, and a big portly man walked in, and Emery Kolb introduced Lint and Blake. he said, "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Governor Hunt, the governor of Arizona, who had been visiting the Grand Canyon at the time." And both Lint and Blake thought he was putting them on, but he wasn't. That was Governor Hunt that was at the Bright Angel that day. When the resupply came back down at Hance Rapid, Edith Kolb came down on a stock animal to see the crew again. Remember, she had spent 12 days with the crew at Lee's Ferry. They were happy to see them. And in Edith's journal, it sounds like she had desired a little bit more of a relationship with Lint, the boatman, but of course he was much older than her, and it was probably just a flirtation. But he invited Edith to ride on his boat through Hance Rapid, and it turns out that Edith Kolb was probably the first woman to ride a major rapid in the Grand Canyon. They left this place, and the next day they arrived at Bright Angel Creek, and the brand new resort called Phantom Ranch had just opened up, not even a year earlier. And again, Emery Kolb and some of the boatmen hiked out again up to Kolb's house at the South Rim. Okay, so we go downstream, and the naming of Upset Rapid. This occurred on September 12th with the river running at a level of 9,700 cubic feet per second. When they were at Lee's Ferry, it was running 32,000 cubic feet per second. So they were taking measurements the whole time. And of course, they were taking measurements at Lee's Ferry and Little Colorado River as well. So we know what the river was running every day of the trip, and the fluctuations were tremendous because of the summer monsoon season. Blake wrote in his journal, "We made 5 miles before noon and expected to make at least 5 more, but had to stop and inspect a rough-looking rapid. The inspection proved that we had been wise in not running it without looking it over." And then Lint wrote, "Emery started in the center and tried to trot across the river, but he didn't quite make it and went over the edge of the boulder and upset. Luckily, the boat was carried out of the hole, but Emery was under the boat and underwater for about 100 yards before he could get out and crawl on top of the upturned boat. And while he was under his boat for those 100 yards, it was a very scary moment for the crew because they had no idea if he was going to come up again." Lint went on to say, "I went to see if Emery was injured. He had gotten a little water in his lungs and was strangled by the painter line. But he soon got over that. We righted his boat and bailed it out. The only damage done was the loss of 1 oar and a pail of lard, which was smeared all over the inside of the rear hold." And then Freeman wrote, "In consideration of the rough work of running, portaging, and lining, the chief drew out the medicine chest for the snakebite medicine and prescribed a liberal dose to all hands." And they had made camp immediately after this, probably at a camp that we all know called Upset Hotel. And you have to remember that the medicine chest that contained the snakebite medicine, this was during Prohibition, but of course the crew was there to make sure that they could sleep well at night. So just before the flood at Lava Falls on September 17th, the expedition was camped just upstream at River Mile 177 on the right-hand side of the river called Cove Canyon. And the river at this date was running 9,380 cubic feet per second. Cubic foot is about the size of a basketball, and that's how many basketballs move by any one spot during 1 second. The radio that they had been using had gone out for repairs at Havasu, and the crew was without news and didn't receive any prior warning of a flood headed their way. They had noticed some passing thunderstorms the previous days and made note of it, but so far the river had not responded to those thunderstorms. So on September 18th, they measured the river and it was 42,800, and Birdseye wrote, "At 6:30 p.m. on September 18th, the river commenced to rise and continued to rise all night at the rate of about 1.5 feet per hour. At 8 p.m., the boats were pounding so badly that quick action became imperative." And of course, it was getting dark by this time. The boys below did not sleep as they were busy all night pulling up first one boat and then another. At 11 p.m., the Marble was afloat and all hands were called to pull her up an additional 8 feet. It was difficult and dangerous work with the waves lashing together on the rocks. Felix went to bed 10 feet above the water, but was flooded out at midnight, and we had to rescue his bed and clothes. During the night, we moved the beds and cook outfit 3 different times. None of us got much sleep. And here's the picture they took the very next day. Remember, they had been drawing the boats up 20 feet from where they were before, 20 vertical feet, and they snapped this picture of the river going by. And if you've ever been on one of these southwestern rivers when they are in flood, the smell and the amount of mud and silt that is in one of these things is astounding, and it takes over your senses. Freeman wrote, "If the radio had been with us, we would have received messages from several stations advising us that one of the heaviest storms in recent years had broken up on the basin of the Little Colorado River. Unwarned, we were surprised at a time and place that were far from favorable. Twilight on the brink of Lava Falls." And here they are after the flood had gone back down, Birdseye, Lint, Blake, and Kolb. This is the Marble that had been up there. Look at how high up onto the rocks it was. That previous picture you saw with the river right there at the keel of the boat is where this boat was located. Birdseye wrote, at 8 a.m., the river had risen. This is September 19th now. At 8 a.m., the river had risen 16 feet and continued to rise slowly all day, reaching the peak of a 21-foot rise by about, it's covering up what it says there, so I can't read it. And we prepared for camping here for several days. He continued, the rapids had an entirely different look in high water. Immense quantities of drift with many large logs floated by during the day, and some were tossed completely out of the water by the large waves. And I should mention that one of the reasons they didn't want to leave here is because their survey points, as they were measuring the descent of the river downstream, was now completely inundated with water. And had they pushed off from shore at this time, they would have lost this long-running count that they were making of how much the river was dropping through the Grand Canyon. By the time they got to Hance Rapid, 77 miles downstream from Lee's Ferry, their measurements were only off by 8 feet, and Birdseye considered that to be a very, very good measurement in that amount of distance. So that was one of the reasons they didn't put on the waters. They wanted to continue with this line of survey down the river, but also, of course, the river would have been much treacherous at that time. And it turns out that it was a flood of 120,000 cubic feet per second had come down the bed of the Little Colorado River. So an official film of the expedition by E.C. LaRue can be found at the following link right here. And I'm going to attempt to just show you a bit of the movie right here. Let's see if this works. And I'm just going to go right here to the Lava Falls part. This movie does not have any sound. This predates sounds at movies. But here you can see the men just beginning to put the boats back into the water. And on account of the flood, the night was spent moving the beds, the boats, and the kitchen as the river rose 20 feet. So while you're looking at this movie, if you want to watch the whole 30-minute film, just write down that URL that you see on your screen right there. And while they were waiting for the river to go down, they hopped into the Prospect Spring. This is the spring that's located there on River Left, right at Lava Falls. Good clear water. You can see the men having fun. They did find a rattlesnake in camp, and they spent about a minute torturing this poor rattlesnake. The flood at Lava Falls detained the party for 3 days, and the boats relaunched on September 22nd. and the survey continued. Okay, so I'm going to finish up the talk tonight with a little bit about the results of the expedition. Here you can see a drawing made by E.C. LaRue that shows what the dam would have looked like just upstream from the mouth of Havasu Creek. And he estimated that the rocks were good enough here for a dam just over 200 feet high. And you can see what the dam would have looked like there. This is one of the drawings from his 1925 paper. And you'll notice the Colorado River has an arrow with the arrow pointed in the downstream direction. You can see that the dam, as he proposed it, was to be constructed upstream from the mouth. There would have been an intake tunnel from the reservoir going into the rocks on river left, and then there would have been a bridge across the mouth of Havasu Creek. And as that falling water would have gone through the powerhouse on river left, it would have created power behind this reservoir. That where the powerhouse is located is where the big motorboats land now when they visit Havasu Creek. Every single one of the dam sites had a canyon profile like this with very precise elevations for both the level of the river and then the crest of the dam and all of the various rock units that the dams were to be built in. This is also from LaRue's paper. This is Mineral Canyon, just about 1 mile downstream from Hance Rapid. This is a downstream view, and you can see where the dam would have gone into the Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite, with the Grand Canyon supergroup tilted layers rising above the dam site. This is farther downstream at the mouth of Diamond Creek, and here we are standing on River Right, looking upstream on the Colorado River. And here they had identified 2 dam sites. One of them was below the mouth of Diamond Creek, and the other one was above the mouth of Diamond Creek. And you can see where the lower dam site would have gone in. This reservoir would have backed up into Diamond Creek and Peach Springs Wash and created quite the arm in the reservoir. But of course, this was never built. And then here in the foreground, you can see the mouth of Diamond Creek. This is where many river trips finish their excursion nowadays. And you can see this dam site built on the upstream side of the mouth of Diamond Creek. Again, just a lack of vegetation in Diamond Creek and along the banks of the Colorado River. This is a close-up view of the Bridge Canyon dam site. And even though this was identified in the 1920s as a good dam site, it actually came very close to seeing the site of a dam in the Grand Canyon in the 1950s by the Bureau of Reclamation. And here's a photograph that I took of the lower Granite Gorge. You can see the ruins in the foreground here. This is actually the ruins from this 1950s era camp when the Bureau of Reclamation built a tramway down to here, and they were actually surveying a dam site for this spot. And I have just put in a dam as it would have existed right there. And this particular dam would have been quite high and backed up reservoir water all the way to the foot of Kanab Creek at River Mile 144. This is probably one of the best pictures of Lava Creek Rapid that I know of. There's not many pictures of Lava Creek Rapid, but this is a view with the party standing on River Right, and on the far left is the mouth of Spencer Canyon on the Wallapai Indian Reservation, and in the lower right you can see the waters of Lava Cliff Rapid. When the waters of Lake Mead backed up into the Grand Canyon, they completely inundated this rapid, and it is no longer present. And they're probably standing on the lava cliff that this rapid gets its name from. And then one last picture of a dam site. This was called Pierce's Ferry Dam Site, 1.5 miles above Pierce Ferry. And what's interesting about this is the very exit of the Grand Canyon. You see the arrow pointing out towards Pierce Ferry, but those are the end of the Grand Canyon rocks right there. And what we notice is that the Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite were at river level when you exited the Grand Canyon. And of course, those rocks are capped with Tepete sandstone. The waters of Lake Mead have completely inundated those rocks. And now the river, as it exists, is flowing at the Bright Angel Shale level on top of the Tepete sandstone. And here's a modern photograph of that. There's the Grand Wash Fault that has offset these rocks, and that fault has 18,000 feet of displacement. But again, that slope that you see that's gold colored is Bright Angel Shale, and the Tepete sandstone and the Vishnu schist are not even shown at all. I took this photograph of Lake Mead when it used to have water in it, of the old Pierce Ferry takeout. This is from 1987. And that previous photograph was taken right there where you see Lake Mead just disappearing back into the mouth of the Grand Canyon. Just a little bit about the reservoir sediment that can be found in the lower part of the Grand Canyon here. When I worked as a river ranger in Grand Canyon in the 1970s, we would take our Boston whaler from Meadview and motor up into the blue waters of Lake Mead, and that silt bank that you see there was about 5 feet underwater. And this is all Colorado River sediment that has completely filled the channel of the Colorado River as it exists in the Grand Canyon. This reservoir sediment is now sloughing away. When the reservoir began to drop in the early 2000s, there was a tamarisk thicket, a tamarisk jungle that grew on top of these sediment beds. And now they're just dried out sticks because they don't get any water. And it's very common to see things like this. One of the most interesting things I've seen in the Lake Mead formation is you can see this cable that's coming out of the sediment here. Now, this cable belongs to the guano enterprise that was developed down here in this part of the Grand Canyon in 1956. And in 1962, an Air Force jet from Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas clipped this cable that was coming down from a stand up on the south rim of the canyon, and it damaged the cable. The Air Force went in and cut down the cable. So that cable fell into Lake Mead in 1962. And what's interesting is that just a few months later, the gates at Glen Canyon Dam closed, and that changed the kind of river water that came down into Lake Mead. And so that cable is actually marking where the sediment bank for Lake Mead was in 1963. And if you look at it, the cable sits right at the contact between very sand-rich sediment below the cable and very mud-rich sediment above it. And if we go back there, you're actually looking at a change in sediment type, because once Glen Canyon Dam was closed, none of this sand came down through the Grand Canyon, or I should say very little of the sand came down through Grand Canyon, and we had more silt and clay that was deposited in Lake Mead. So that's pretty interesting that this geologic contact can be dated by the use of the guano cableway that used to be here. Somebody has cut the cable now, and you don't see this cable coming out at that place anymore. Anyway, that's my take on the Birdseye expedition. Thank you all for joining me tonight, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I do want to bring to all the listeners' attention that in just about 3 weeks, the Museum of Northern Arizona is going to be opening an exhibit about the geologic map of the Grand Canyon. And this exhibit will hang in the museum until January of 2025. So if your travels bring you to Flagstaff, Arizona in the next 8 months, stop by the Museum of Northern Arizona to see an exhibit that describes how this geologic map was made nearly 50 years ago. And the Museum of Northern Arizona is bringing this map back for sale. It's been out of print for 15 years, but it is coming back. and we're very happy about that. Tom, I'm unable
Yes.
to see my cursor at all, so if you could
All
just
right.
stop my share,
I'm going to do that right now.
thank you.
And also, probably we'll stop the recording shortly. There we go. Are you still, I'm seeing you, Wayne. You're no
Yep, I'm
longer
here.
good. So you're still the speaker, Wayne, and we have a few questions from the audience. Uh, one is from David King. What equipment was used to measure, presumably, the river flow and cubic feet per second or CFS? You know what kind
Well,
of device was used?
I don't think that the river party was measuring the flow. The flows were being measured at Phantom Ranch, Lee's
Mhm.
Ferry, and on the Little Colorado River.
Okay.
So,
Uh, I'm not a hydrologist, but I'm trying to think of what equipment would have been used in the 20s to measure river flow, and it might have been some sort of a anemometer which measured the velocity of the water, and then from that, with the dimensions, one could have calculated the cubic feet. But we have Jonathan Upchurch on the call, so he could probably wax on about how to measure water flow.
well, we'll ask Jonathan that, but George Marsick is also on
Oh yes.
the talk tonight, and George and I worked at Phantom Ranch in the mid
Mhm.
70s, and Roy Starkey was still taking measurements of the river the old-fashioned way. He would go out across the river at 5 foot intervals and drop a torpedo in the river that would measure the speed of the water and the
Uh-huh.
depth of the water.
Right.
And taking that measurement across, he could add all those
Sure.
qualities up and then determine what the flow of the river was.
Yeah, you had to have an anemometer, some velocity measurement. Uh,
Right.
that's how the instruments are used for pipelines and so forth, of which I'm a little more familiar. Let's see if there's we had one attendee who Dick Smith who says not a member. He's been in flag, I guess, as a NAU road scholar for 11 months. Now he spelled road as in a pavement, but I don't know if he meant road scholar.
No,
Um,
no, no. He spelled it right.
he spelled
It's
it
Road
right.
Scholar is a program, an educational program.
Got it. Thank you. And he just wanted to know how to be able would like to participate or at least attend these more regularly. They're totally open to the public, and there's a notice about it in several places. The website is always refreshed with the information about these virtual outings. And then for members, the easiest way is just sign up and be a member uh, for $35. Then you get the automatic mailings, which is an extension of our bulletin. But if you just choose not to be a member, then it's still open to the public, and it's both past, present, and future outings are at our website. And since Wayne and I are sharing in the website updates, we're trying to keep those up to date and so forth. I'm I'm not sure when we cut out the recording, Wayne. Do you recall if we have the Q&A in the recording? Okay,
Uh, I'm not sure. Are we still
well,
recording now?
we're still recording. I don't see. I mean, see. You can look at the messages yourself. I see uh,
Yeah, one
several.
here is from Richard Cordaroli. He
Yes,
tells everybody that KHJ stands for kindness, happiness, and joy. I
yes,
hope
I see
that's
that.
true.
Hmm.
And Earl, I'm very sorry for mispronouncing your name, but thank you for being brave enough to tell us to pronounce it as Spalmer. Thank you very much. And Vic Smith, I hope you will become a member of
Yep.
the Historical Society. Beth, thank you for your comment about the interesting lecture. I appreciate that. Kim, same thing. Dick Brown and Jody. Thank you, Jody. So, anything else, anybody, verbally
Well,
or in the chat?
it's interesting, Wayne, because you taught me something about English pronunciation. If there's a vowel followed by a double consonant, the vowel is soft, as in Lassen, the volcanic national park, and as in your name. Now, Earl,
Right.
you're an exception because English is full of exceptions. So it is a softer a spalmer, and we've got that now hopefully memorized.
Yes.
Well, hope everyone enjoyed tonight's talk, and you'll be able to attend the talk in June. Wayne, thank you so much for expanded version of the talk that we enjoyed in November, and look forward to working with you on future talks.
Good
Thanks,
job,
everybody.
Wayne.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and thank you all for attending.